Every year, natural disasters destroy our planet, costing thousands and sometimes millions to rebuild. One especially that is talked about a lot is hurricanes. There has been talk about hurricanes getting more powerful, with talks about even possibly a Category 6. One recent hurricane which probably all of us have heard about was Hurricane Helene. This hurricane was a Category 4 and it made landfall in Florida. It soon came here in North Carolina where it did most of its damage in the mountains. While Category 4 hurricanes are common, less common ones are Category 5. Out of all the Category 5 hurricanes, Hurricane Katrina is talked about the most. Not just because it's a Category 5 hurricane, but because of the destruction left behind. I wanted to talk about this because we need to understand how this hurricane hurt a well-known city and how it's still affecting it today. Part 1 about Hurricane Katrina. The hurricane first developed as a tropical depression over the Bahamas. It then hit Florida as a Category 1 hurricane, where it spent most of its time on land. After it passed Florida, it then intensified because of the warm waters in the Gulf of Mexico, shortening into a Category 3 hurricane. Then a Category 5 until finally it hit Louisiana as a Category 4 hurricane. Even though I'm going to focus on New Orleans, it's important to note that it did hit, which I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this right, Plaquemines Parish first, which is 45 miles from New Orleans, about 50 minutes. So why focus on New Orleans instead of Plaquemines? Well, even though Katrina hit New Orleans as a Category 3 hurricane, there was still a lot of damage. Flooding is the main concern. New Orleans is located below sea level, and on top of that, it has 2 lakes, which overwhelmed and destroyed the city. The 2 lakes' names were Lake Pontchartrain and Lake Borgne. It was also reported that the canal from the Mississippi River also caused flooding. About 1.2 million people left before the storm hit, but a lot of people chose to stay. About 80% of the city was submerged underwater. So, what happened to the survivors who were left? Well, let's look at the National Library of Medicine article, which talks about this. They say that what happened to New Orleans is a good example of a response to natural disasters. As I said, some people left while others stayed, and the ones who stayed would soon regret this because of the canal rupture of the Mississippi River. Lots of them died because they got trapped in their homes as water rose. Others because they couldn't swim, and those who could swim swam on top of their roofs, but died because of lack of aid. Because this was showing all over the news, lots of people would sit and watch as responders were too slow to help people who were trapped. There were also weren't enough areas for supplies for survivors. Even with shelters that agencies like Red Cross set up weren't enough. The New Orleans government wasn't of any help and was bad at notifying the federal government. Also, since the city was underwater, all hospitals were destroyed and unusable. One article mentions how post-Katrina governance in New Orleans reinforced existing power, meaning that they were controlling who could speak about what was happening. Groups like Black, working class, and female residents were ignored. They were also silencing people's testimonies. This furthermore shows the unfairness that the people in New Orleans were dealing with, and how this probably impacted them negatively. Part 2. Mental state. Toward the end of this article, it mentions how first responders were seriously affected because they were finding many people who didn't survive. Many first responders didn't get help until it was too late. The next article, which was Impact of Residential Greenness on Psychological Distress Among Hurricane Katrina Survivors, published by ProQuest. This article to me was interesting to add because it compares people's mental state to vegetation changes because of Hurricane Katrina. In this article, they test 2 hypotheses. The first being residential greenness in post-disaster location is positively associated with mental health. Their second hypothesis is changes in residential greenness are associated with adverse mental health and that they may pose disruptions to place attachment. The reason that they are researching this is to see if there is a correlation between greenness and mental health and natural disasters. Usually people with good mental state tend to live in better places. They gathered a survey from one that was taken in 2004 to 2005 from low-income parents in New Orleans. They ended up redesigning the same test after Katrina happened, along with 3 follow-up surveys that happened a year apart from each other. The first redesigned test was from 2006 to 2007, the second was 2009 to 2010, and lastly 2016 to 2018, which was the last one. When measuring the psychological distress, they did it using Kessler's K6 scale, which is a way to measure psychological distress on a range and not a specific diagnosis. For example, instead of just diagnosing someone with post-traumatic stress disorder, this gives them a broad spectrum. They also made sure to adjust this so that race and age wouldn't be a problem. And they also asked whether people were receiving benefits during each survey. Next, to calculate residential greenness, they would get data from MODIS, which is Modern Resolution Imaging Spectrometer. They also use RG, which deals with Google Earth Engine API. They created a buffer around residential address and gathered the mean EVI and MVDI within each buffer across growing seasons, which ranges between June and August, which was also the time of each interview. EVI stands for Enhanced Vegetation Index, while NDVI stands for Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. Each one of the participants was assigned an NDVI and EVI value based on where their homes were located, and this counted for each of the surveys. Sometimes neighborhood levels are in categories including income and racial factors. So to account for these, they use an NCDI index, which stands for Neighborhood Concentrated Disadvantage, which is different percent levels. The results. Overall, residential greenness stayed the same across each survey. Lots of participants relocated between each survey, but with each new one, or the redesigned one, this decreased. Going back to their hypothesis for the first one, they didn't find any evidence to support this, meaning that there wasn't any difference in psychological distress between the participants living in high and low green neighborhoods, which is the EVI, but results for NDVI were consistent. For the second hypothesis, they did find evidence that supports this. Participants whose greenness changed between baseline and T1, low to high or high to low, had increased out of psychological distress, meaning that they would most likely have some. Even though they saw changes between TI results, they didn't with the later tests. Overall, I feel as if this study was interesting to do, and again, I've never seen anything like this before. As you can see, it seems that natural disasters will at least cause some distress in the beginning, but it seems that most people tend to have less distress as the years go on. Part 3. Vegetation. Since we discussed greenness and how it might impact people, let's talk about how there were vegetation changes because of Katrina. This article from Science Direct discussed this very well. They wanted to see how vegetation has changed. So to do this, they use aircraft images, which kind of replicates satellite images, to see the changes. They were able to see areas in New Orleans and determine which areas had the greatest number of vegetation. Lakeview neighborhood had the most, which was compared to other neighborhoods with less. The images that they collected were pre-Katrina 2004, post-Katrina 2005, and years later in 2019. They were trying to answer 3 questions. The first one, which New Orleans neighborhoods that were flooded in 2005 after Hurricane Katrina had the highest loss of tree canopy cover from 2004-2005. Second question is, which section of flooded neighborhoods from Hurricane Katrina have recovered the most tree canopy cover since late 2005, post-Katrina? Last question is, how has vegetation covered in flooded neighborhoods from Hurricane Katrina changed between 2004, pre-Katrina, to 2019? The methods they used, which I mentioned, were airborne/aircraft images, layered data collected from each neighborhood, large tree canopy coverage, and statistical tools. Layered data is basically layers of the earth and satellite images. It's kind of hard to explain, but basically if you use Google Earth, you can select different layers. It's kind of like that. The results they got were, from pre-Katrina, from 2004 to 2005, large tree canopies covered 10 to 20% of neighborhood surfaces areas. This area especially would later be flooded. About 90% covered Mid-City and Lower Lakeview, and 12% in Lower 9th Ward, 7th Ward, and Lower Gently Terrace neighborhoods. Also, loss of trees caused damage. Some survived, which was located along major streets and wide boulevards. But because of floodwater, lots of these didn't survive and were damaged. Now in 2019, they decided to see how this impacted the area by comparing the tree coverage. This was a huge difference. For example, Lower Lakeview, which in 2004 was 90%, was now at 9%, a whole 10% down from when it was in 2004. They found that the most affected wards were Lower 9th Ward and 7th Ward. It's also cool to note that there were a lot of vacant lots in 2012. And I wanted to go back to the previous article with surveys to say that this may be the reason why people left, due to vegetation loss in these areas. The next article is also a continuation of this one, and I would just put some pictures up because it's kind of talking about the same thing but just giving a bit more information. Part 4, wetlands. Now let's talk about wetlands and the world and how this wasn't only a loss but a gain as well. The article is similar to the vegetation article, but instead of aerial images they use satellite imagery. While this doesn't focus on New Orleans, it focuses on a different part of Louisiana, Barataria Basin, which is west of New Orleans. This whole area is almost at the end part of Louisiana. If you see on the map, you can see almost by its boot, a water area. That's where it's located. This is still important to talk about because it does affect them still, since it's close to New Orleans. This basin was already at a loss due to resources being collected long ago and other things as well, like declining wetland coverage. This is focusing more about how the hurricane affected it. The methods they used were land and water index, spatial data layers, and surveys. The loss that they observed was in areas like Bayou and Harvey, which were most of those lands turned into water. This was mostly concentrated along shorelines and previously vegetated margins. Land gains were mostly in delta farms and marshlands. The construction of the seawall restoration projects was made to help balance everything out because of the land gain and loss. So how can hurricanes do all this? Well, hurricanes themselves do not make new land. They can push land away from coastlines, which creates it. Or when storm surge gets too much, it makes land disappear due to rising tides. Part 5, post-Katrina tourism. So how do people in New Orleans deal with surviving Katrina? Well, tourism is a way that they deal with it because they can share stories with people who probably came because of Katrina and because how it made New Orleans more known. Even though this area was probably already known before, like I said, it probably became more known because of the hurricane. New Orleans is already a well-known city, and lots of articles written about the city was already targeted towards the Black community. After Katrina happened, it became more popular with people asking for hurricane tours, which one person was doing. Her name was Corsart. She would do these tours. People would then target Corsart and would tell her that what she was doing was wrong. But then she would say, what was television news if not gawking at profiting off the other's misery? Basically calling them hypocrites of what they're already doing in New Orleans. Stories like hers could be seen as a way of exploitation, but also as a way to convey the devastation. Questions by the researchers were wanting to be answered. The researchers were the people who wrote the article. Some questions that they wanted to be answered was, how exactly are these stories being told to tourists? It's important to note what New Orleans was a city where tourism was already vital for the city. So this would also be a way to see if stories shared were all true. The researchers' investigation ran between June through November from 2014 to 2015, which was just around the 10th anniversary of Katrina. They went not as reporters, but as people just wanting to know how it felt like to be a tourist in New Orleans post-Katrina. They ended up conducting 20 semi-structured interviews with people who were involved in the tourist industry. The methods that they did or used was 20 people. They were mostly male from early 20s to late 70s. They were living already in New Orleans when Katrina happened, or they were helping out people dealing with Katrina. They took different tours, like city buses, bike tours, and museums. They also used video recordings. While walking through the city, one thing they noticed was how there wasn't any trace of Katrina. That is, if you were going to New Orleans without knowing anything about what had happened, you wouldn't even know that there was a hurricane that had passed through here. Even though you couldn't visually see what had happened, the tours and public art made up for that. The researchers ended up attending a parade on the anniversary, which was a way to bring people together through culture practices. It was also a way to participate in response to memory of distress without actually saying that. There was a negative impact on the second line performances, and the event attracted political and news outlets. But after they all left and said their stuff, the real memorial began. The reporters were marked as a racial minority along with other white migrants who had just moved there. But despite this, they were welcome and became part of the event. This event was a great example of what people would do. It brought people together and also connected pre-Katrina New Orleans, bringing back the old. 9 years after the hurricane, the community of New Orleans thought it would be nice to talk about what happened, so that's what started these stories. All the stories share a common theme, which was the destruction of the city. All the guides who led these tourists shared stories of the community. Maybe that's why they were the ones to give these tours, because they all lived while the hurricane happened, or they helped in some way. People who were given tour guides commented on how they get to experience these things firsthand or hear about them. They would hire people to give tours who had experienced them, like I said. The people whom the researchers interviewed all gave a strong sense of wanting to share their stories and the reality of living here. One of the respondents, Sylvia, mentioned that everyone wants to tour, but then they get disappointed because they want to see the devastation. They also don't understand why survivors still live here. It's because it's their home. They can't just leave easily. They do this to teach people. For example, on one of the tours the researchers went on, they stopped by the guide's house. He explained how he was getting his house gutted, as in a way to minimize flooding. Part 6. Village in Louisiana. Wrapping up on how people were affected, let's talk about how this Vietnamese village is dealing with post-Katrina. The term urban agriculture is the practice of farming within an urban environment, especially the civilization of food crops for human consumption. This village uses this as a way to recover after Katrina. They were able to do this because they had help from the community, specifically a church. Also using traditional Vietnamese techniques like gardening and farming. Also families who supported each other, and also speaking up what they wanted, like rebuilding some parts. By doing all of this, they were able to show cultural, just like houses with plants, which was how a traditional backyard would look. Katrina destroyed lots of their farmland, but in 2008, they made a whole plan to rebuild this whole area. This whole article is a perfect example of how even smaller communities in New Orleans will fight for themselves in order to not be forgotten. They also did all of this fairly quickly, which is cool to see. Part 7, wrapping up. So, what does the future hold for New Orleans? This year in August will be the 20th anniversary since Katrina impacted the people of New Orleans, some in a positive way while others in a negative way. Since then, the question people might have is, what would happen if this happens again? Well, back in 2021, Hurricane Ida hit Louisiana. I think the crazy part is that it happened on August 29, which is the same day Katrina hit. It was more powerful than Katrina, with flooding and power outages and destruction. Though the flooding didn't submerge the city because they were prepared since Katrina. But like Katrina, there was a lot of news coverage. This is an example of, yes, this can happen again. Just like Hurricane Ida, things could end up getting worse. But knowing this, people of New Orleans could now be prepared for what's to come.